Hi everyone, welcome. Thank you for being here, and thank you very much for the introduction, all of your help today. I'm Kate Mullersman. Like Debbie said, I'm a psychiatrist specializing in working with kids and teenagers. I'm in my last year of training at the U, and my work brings me all across the Twin Cities. We work at the Masonic Children's Hospital, the Masonic Institute for the Developing Brain. I do some work at Children's in St. Paul. I've worked at HCMC, the 916 School District, Hazelden, kind of all over. So in case any of you are familiar with those, I've been really grateful to be able to have that experience. I'm also a parent to a young kid. He's almost 2, cutest kid I've ever seen. I'm biased. And my presentation today is about how youth are using the internet, how it's different than maybe people have used technology in the past, what's going on with their mental health, and maybe how we can try to explain some of those connections, and also what we can do to support the kids and teenagers we know in our lives. It's an important topic for me as a parent and as a physician, and I imagine it's similarly important for many of you. So thank you all for being here. Just a brief outline of what we'll talk about today. Introductions is more like if anyone wants to share kind of questions or ideas that they have to start, we can do that. We'll talk about how kids and teenagers use the internet, smartphones, social media, current mental health challenges for kids and teenagers, and then trying to make some connections, talking about child development, what's going on socially and biologically with kids and teenagers that may make some of these challenges harder than it is for adults. Talking about what we can do, so proposals that have been made, and also welcome your ideas, and then wrap up.
I just want to say that you can lower these seats.
Thank you. Glad everyone settle in, feel comfortable. Get up if you need to. Whatever. I think that I'm slightly mic'd. I am getting over laryngitis, so if you can't hear me, just raise your hand and let me know. All right, so how are kids and teens using the internet today? Let's go back. Just to start, I'd love to hear from any of you, totally optional. If you'd like to share who you are and why you're interested in this topic, feel free to raise your hand. And we have this, actually never seen one of these before, but a mic box so that your voice is recorded. You don't have to use it, but yeah. Does anyone feel like sharing what brings them to this presentation, or any questions, comments you have before we start? Oh yeah, sure. I'll put you all in charge of the box after this. How about that? And you can just go on an empty chair while it's not in use.
So I joined mostly for personal. I have an 11-year-old who loves to be online. But also I'm a speech pathologist for St. Paul Public Schools, so I work with a lot of kids too, and so kind of both reasons.
Great. Well, thank you for your work in the schools. Really appreciate it. Let's go.
My name's Julie Jacobs, and I have 4 grown children, but I have 8 grandchildren, the oldest of whom is 11, and she just got an iPhone, and she knows more about how to use my phone than I do.
Yes.
She can show me things, and there are limits that her mom has put on her iPhone, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's great.
Hi everyone, I'm Meredith Hicks. I have an 8.5-year-old daughter, so curious for her well-being, and also my professional work is in adolescent health, and I know this is a topic that's constantly evolving and new, and so hoping to learn more.
Great. Just set it on the chair if that's all right, or maybe Debbie. Perfect. Thanks, Debbie. I thank you all for sharing. I think this is a super common concern. It's one I hear about all the time as a doctor. Like, what should I do about my kids on their phone all the time? It's one I hear about when kids come into the emergency department, bless you. And it's one that I'm also thinking about as a new parent. What am I going to do in the world today? It's different than when I grew up. And I think it's important to be aware of that. So let's just talk first about some numbers around how kids are using the internet and especially social media. As you all have alluded to, I think it doesn't take data to know that kids are online a lot, and that it can be concerning for a lot of people. But the Pew Research Center put out a report in 2022 that just kind of breaks down things like time, demographics, that kind of thing. So I thought we'd go over that, even though I think we all know kids are online a lot. So first, there's just the sheer amount of usage. In 2022, 46% of teenagers said that they use the internet, quote, nearly constantly. That's compared to just 24% in 2014, 2015. So less than 10 years later, double the amount of kids feel like they're online all the time. 48%, separate from the 46, said that they're online several times a day. And so that leaves just 6% of kids who say that they're online once a day or less. We all use the internet. It's a lot, like, increasingly used in school, which I suspect drives some of this. But yeah, they're online a lot. They also break down the places that kids spend time online by site. You'll note that YouTube has the most heavy usage. Almost 20% of kids say that they're constantly on YouTube, and almost 95% say that they have used YouTube. Closely followed by TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, and Facebook. So kids are spending a lot of time on social media and on places where the users generate content. And it's not just a little bit of use, it's a lot of use. The 95%, this is about access to smartphones. So that's come up. Kids get these phones. What do they do with them? In 2022, 95% of teens said that they had access to a smartphone. That's an increase of about 30% compared to 2014, 2015, when only 3/4 of kids had access to a smartphone. Smaller percentages report having access to a desktop, laptop, or gaming console, and those numbers haven't really changed. I don't get into it too much in this presentation, but there is also demographic components where kids from higher earning families tend to have more access to desktop, laptop, and gaming consoles versus across the board. In most economic situations, a lot of kids have access to smartphones. And then just what do kids say about their own use? 55% reported that the amount of time they spend is about right. But about the same percentage, 54%, say it would be very hard for them to reduce their usage or quit their usage. Teen girls are more likely to report than teen boys that they would have a hard time reducing their usage. And a greater percentage of older teens compared to younger kids also would have a hard time reducing their usage. Also, a note, so that kind of gets a sense of what kids think about it and how easy or hard they think it would be to stop. I just gave some stats about girls and boys. I just want to highlight that there are a couple of instances in this presentation where data is broken down by gender, and obviously lots of kids don't fit into those categories or fit into multiple categories. Most of the data reports out as girls or boys, and there isn't always a lot of distinction around how they come up with that data. So I use what's in the reports and the data available, but just want to acknowledge that, of course, many kids don't fit into those categories or fit into different categories. So yeah, kids are online a lot. And I think the reason that many of us are here is because there is growing concern that living your life increasingly online is affecting kids and teenagers' mental health in pretty profound ways. Want to go over some of the research about what may, quote unquote, really be going on. I guess first, just to acknowledge that it's not all bad. So there are studies that show benefit to increasing access to communities and information online through social media, through access to smartphones. There has been research that shows that online internet use can forward the development of really critical developmental tasks of childhood and adolescence. Compared to when the internet and sort of social media was just starting, increasingly, research shows that kids' online lives mimic their offline lives. So the people who they're friends with, what their interests are, what their identities are more similar online now to their offline lives than they were maybe 10 or 15 years ago. That can correlate with positive self-esteem, identity formation, self-disclosure, all really normal tasks, especially of adolescents. And that can be especially true for youth who are from backgrounds that have been marginalized, so racial and ethnic minorities, sexual and gender minorities, and neurodiverse and neuroatypical youth. So they might find more benefit. Surgeon General's report also gave some positive statistics. One was that 7 out of 10 girls of color, adolescent girls of color, encountered positive and identity-affirming content related to their race across social media platforms. And a majority of adolescents, almost 60%, said that social media helps them feel more accepted. More of them felt like they have people who can support them through tough times. They have a place to show their creative side, and they feel more connected to what's going on in their friends' lives. I think all of that makes sense. A lot of these platforms are creative. You're able to engage much more often, a lot of times with your peers than before the advent of smartphones. And kids can really use it as a way to express and affirm their identities. And so there's research to support that some of this use is good. But, of course, there's a but. Why else would we be here? There has been such a rapid growth of use of social media. So I looked this up yesterday. Facebook debuted in 2004. The first iPhone was released in 2007. So we're just at like 15 years after some pretty massive cultural changes. And over the same period, there's been kind of seemingly an explosion of distress and crisis related to kids and teenagers' mental health. If you work in this field, you've certainly seen it. If you're a parent, you've certainly seen it. It's just something that's everywhere. And so is there not just a correlation, but could there be some causation? And certainly there's a lot of concern. In 2023, concern about this possible correlation of the effect of internet use, social media, mental health, rose to the extent that the Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, published a general advisory about social media and youth mental health. Usually these advisories are really reserved for kind of the most extreme public health issues that require urgent attention from the American people. So it just kind of demonstrates that this is high on the radar for people at kind of the top of the public health infrastructure in the United States. The report highlights that there are likely benefits and risks, and that we need to bring some nuance to this, and we do need a lot more information. This quote reads, "The body of evidence indicates that while social media may have some benefits, there are ample indicators that social media can also have a profound risk of harm to the mental health and well-being of children and adolescents. At this time, we do not yet have enough evidence to determine if social media is sufficiently safe for children and adolescents, and that we need more data, a greater body of research, and that we need to urgently take action of these things, about these issues." The Surgeon General was not the only one kind of raising the alarm on these issues. Just a few days before that advisory, our colleagues in psychology from the American Psychological Association published their own health advisory about social media use and teen mental health. They gave 10 recommendations, including kind of how to better structure and oversee internet use to match children's need developmental levels, how to balance internet use with other developmental tasks, and how to monitor for extreme content and problematic use. And a few years earlier than that, in Pediatrics, which is the journal of the Association for Pediatricians, they published an article about the benefits and costs of social media use. And the authors state, once again, there can be benefits, there's ample evidence that there are also downsides, and they particularly point out that increase in social media use can contribute to cyberbullying, depression, social anxiety, and exposure to developmentally inappropriate content. So trends like the ones you see here, which are published in the journal Nature in 2023, highlight that the rise in depression rates among teenagers seems to coincide with the rise in social media use. So the top bar here is percent clinical depression incidence. So that's new cases of depression, and among 16 to 17-year-olds, you see it rising from just over 10% in 2006 to about 22, 23% in 2021. And then social media use by 12th graders. This is daily use of social media in hours. Obviously, there was none really in 2006, and then they started tracking the data in 2012. We go from kids spending maybe an hour and a half online a day to over 3 hours a day. And both of these lines are trending in the same direction. Is there a connection between what's happening, or is it coincidence?
Quick question on that.
Yeah.
So is that saying that 21% of 16 to 17-year-olds will be clinically depressed?
This is incidence of clinical depression would be how many kids are diagnosed with depression in that year clinically. And this is 21%, 1 in 5, which is pretty consistent across different measures. Yeah. Similar numbers for anxiety. I think it's actually closer to 25% for anxiety. Also, of course, noting that 2021 is right as COVID was happening, and there have been certainly, COVID is absolutely a factor in this. I think that's been pretty indisputable in a lot of the research, but yes, yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, about 1 in 5 kids who are 16 to 17 in this data, in this chart.
Quick question, and maybe this is ahead, does the research show how much parents are online compared to their kids?
That is a great point. I don't cover that in this presentation,
Okay,
but there
sorry.
is, it's a great question. Actually, the Surgeon General also published a health advisory about parenting recently, and about kind of all of the, kind of how demanding parenting has becoming in the age of COVID, of kids being online, of ultra high pressure for their kids to succeed in various ways. So that is absolutely a great thing to consider. We won't talk about it today, but yeah, great question. Yeah.
I have experience that a month ago I have this group of youth that were sharing about how like internet, like technology affect their life. The ages between 16 to 21 was like 46 students in the classroom. And most of them believe, like almost all of them, they raised up their hand. They asked, like, are we developing parental, like children, you know, you parental, that you make them safe, parental, like you set up account that how many hours they use.
Oh, yeah.
So then they want the same thing to be set up for parents.
Oh, interesting.
They were asking that question.
Yeah. No, I think that's a
They're
great.
like, our parents use more than us, but then the data is not after them, it's after us.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that this, I think, again, this is not necessarily backed by my own study of the research, but I think there is an epidemic of smartphone and internet use among everyone. Today we'll focus on kind of developmentally why kids and teens might be more susceptible. But yes, it's true. I mean, kids notice what we're doing with our phones. And there's been interesting studies of infants. If you study child development, you know, decades ago they would do studies where parents would engage with their baby and then ignore their baby just by kind of looking away. Which is hard to do because the babies would start getting distressed, and it's this idea that kids need to know that their parental figure is interested in them and invested in them from a very early age. And they've replicated that study with parents kind of just like scrolling on their smartphone in what I think most of us would see as a pretty benign or routine way while they're in the presence of their infant. And the infant is similarly distressed as when parents would kind of give us just a stern face or just look away. And I see this happening in my own life. Like I'm trying I'm worried about my kid, but I also am like, I need to look at my own habits of smartphone use, because
Right.
if I expect him not to be interested, but he sees me interested in it all the time, yeah, what does that say to him? And so, no, I think that's wonderful that your students are picking up, or the kids that you work with are picking up on kind of the hypocritical stance that we take a lot of times. And obviously, as adults, our jobs are to try to guide kids through their childhood and make them prepared to be adults. And we think that we have some amount of control or say in how they do that. And so we try to set things up for success, and we'll talk about that at the end. But I suspect that it's a broader issue that we also need to look at within ourselves, or I certainly need to look at it within myself as just a person and a parent.
Thank you.
But to me, it raises the question. You talk about correlation versus causality, and if parents are online and on their phones all the time and ignoring their kids, and the kids are using, so it may look as though, this is what makes it complex. It may look as though it's the children's use, but depression may increase because parents are ignoring their kids. And that's just, it's hard to tease out all those variables.
Completely, and I think we'll get into that a little bit, and I'll show some of the data from a book I really like, but I agree it's nuanced, and no matter what, I think it's probably unrealistic to think that we will get rid of smartphones completely in any kind of short or medium-term basis, and so we have to deal with the complexity of, this can't be black or white, off and on. Kids have been struggling forever, and this is one new added component. So, and like you said, what we do affects kids too. No, I think these are really, really important points, and ones that are not always front and center among these kind of research reports and news articles and stuff, just because it can get so complex. So yeah, let me get into some data from a book that I read this year. It's called The Anxious Generation: How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. And this author, Jonathan Haidt, who's, I believe, a social psychologist, does really try to make a causal link in this book. And I think that certainly is open to criticism, and people have criticized him for it. And I don't agree with everything he says, but I found it to be a helpful framework for thinking about some of these issues for myself. So he actually posits that it's been a dual process that has led to a rise in, led to the kids' mental health crisis we see today. The first process, he argues, started in the 80s and 90s with increased overprotection in the physical world of kids and teenagers. So basically decreases in kids being given independent playtime with more kind of a parental surveillance state that became pretty normalized. And that then this kind of crescendoed and coincided with the rise of the mass availability of smartphones starting in 2010, and that there was sort of this overprotection in the physical world and an underprotection in life online that together have contributed to worsening depression and anxiety disorders for kids and teenagers. Like I said, plenty of criticisms to be had about causal claims in the book. But there's some interesting data, so I'll go through that, and then we can kind of talk more about it, at the end or as we go. So they provide data on percentage of U.S. undergraduates diagnosed with a mental illness. You'll see that anxiety, as I said, is above 24%, so about 1 in 4. Depression is at 20%, so 1 in 5, with some rise in ADHD as well. Versus things like bipolar disorder, anorexia, substance use, and schizophrenia remaining approximately stable. This cuts off before COVID, I should mention. And this is meant to demonstrate that the sort of mental health crisis is about what we might call internalizing disorders, so things that cause distress and discomfort and real kind of psychic pain internally, versus ways that other people might be able to see some of the symptoms of something like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. Throughout all of the data that I show from this book, you'll notice that there's this gray kind of block that's highlighted, and this is the period when he says smartphones became more ubiquitous. So just so you know, that's some background. We won't talk about that too much here, but that's what that is. This is anxiety prevalence. So once again, just kind of breaking down the numbers. This is meant to argue that anxiety is really hitting younger kids hardest, and that Gen Z in particular has been hit harder than other generations in terms of increases in anxiety. So prevalence is the amount of people with a diagnosis of anxiety at any given time, not necessarily a new diagnosis, but you see that for people over 50, it's not only, but it's about 4% and closer to 20% for people who would be in Gen Z in 2022.
This is also taking the pandemic into account.
Absolutely, yes. And he would argue that you still see a rise, pretty steep rise in the younger generation from 2010 to 2020. I mean, yeah, it's nearly double, but absolutely these numbers are affected by COVID. Yeah.
It affects all across the age, not only the younger generations?
Yeah, so this shows that anxiety is kind of, rising anxiety is kind of endemic across most age groups. It seems like older people are a little bit more protected from that increase in rate, but starting, and again, this is 2020. So what you really see is among people under 34, the rate started rising earlier. Again, he would say with the rise of smartphones, and he correlates that very closely. Versus for people over 35, the rate increases a little bit later, and then certainly there's a bump in 2020, which, again, not causal, but COVID happened then, so a lot more anxiety. And then he says it's not just self-report, there's also kind of behavioral or real data that demonstrate that these symptoms are becoming more prevalent and more severe. This is US Department emergency visits for self-harm for young teenagers and kids, tweens, ages 10 to 14. You see a really, precipitous rise among young girls, and a smaller but still significant rise among boys. And I worked in the emergency department through the pandemic, and certainly I saw this. But this actually does cut off at 2020, so we're still seeing a rise before then. And then this is meant to show that this phenomenon is really kind of restricted to younger girls. So we have 14 to 19 here, versus 20 and above, there really is not that same rate. And so this is really affecting kids, it seems, more than adults. Now, teenagers and young adults tend to do things like cut more than adults anyway, but still there are these rises. This is a chart showing rates of hospitalization for self-harm. Again, a precipitous rise starting in about 2010 and continuing through 2020. And Haidt argues that this demonstrates that not only are there more people with things like anxiety and self-harm, but also those symptoms are more severe than the past, requiring hospitalization. That's a correlation, not a causation, but that's his argument. And then this is teen suicide rates. So he argues that the correlation of widespread smartphone use and mental health outcomes is highlighted by examining the rates of suicide with sharp increases for both girls and boys in this period right here. He also notes that the rate, and that overall, the suicide rate among boys increased more than the self-harm rate among boys. And suicide is, certainly kind of suicidality is the most severe, most concerning symptom for boys. And he notes that the suicide rate for teen girls is the highest it's ever been. And that's consistent across different countries as well. This is again showing, so this previous graph was suicide rates among 15 to 19-year-olds. This is suicide rates for younger adolescents, 10 to 14, and again, a precipitous and frankly horrifying increase in rates over the last 15 years. 91% for boys, and 167% increase for girls. Yeah,
Those are suicide attempts or actual suicide?
that's suicide rate.
Oh,
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry.
Mhm.
The age is it purposely cut off 14 or is it?
It's just the way the data was collected. You know, it's interesting. Again, I don't get into it a lot here, but there is a difference in kind of peak of these symptoms for girls versus boys. Girls tend to go through puberty earlier, and they tend to have these spikes in things like anxiety, self-harm, suicidality, more corresponding to that early puberty, and boys are a little bit later. So it happens that for girls, that tends to be before 14, and for boys, it tends to be after 14. I don't know if that's why they broke the data down that way, but that's kind of what the evidence shows.
2 boys, one is 15 and one is 14.
Okay. Yeah. It's and of course every kid is different. Those are just generalizations, but I think they probably just were doing it in 5-year increments, and that's kind of how it worked out. Yes, that's on average. We do know that on a population level, puberty is happening earlier, especially for girls, and so I think that gap might be widening. I can't speak to the exact numbers, but yeah, so for girls, these things tend to happen 12, 13-ish. For boys, it's more like 14, 15-ish.
Do you know what the numbers look like if you took the girls at that age who in theory could be going through or have already gone through puberty and look at boys who are also, they'd be older, but
Yeah.
they would be going through or have gone through puberty? Do you know what the differential is between them?
That's an interesting question. I haven't seen data broken down where the cutoff is not age, but kind of developmental status.
Comparing 12-year-old girl to 12-year-old boys.
Oh yeah,
it's
hugely
like apples
different.
and oranges.
And I think that's one reason why, I suspect that that's one reason why the percentage has increased so much more for girls in this age group relative to boys in this age group, versus the prior slide. It's a little bit, I mean, it's still very high, but a little bit less dramatic compared to the first slide for girls than for boys. But it would be interesting to see that broken down by developmental level. I just haven't seen that research. Yeah.
And are these pretty consistent across population, or are there certain like identities or demographics that experience disparities within?
Yeah. Also a great question. I don't have data on it here, but yes, there are demographic disparities. Kids from more marginalized backgrounds, such as racial and ethnic minorities, tend to have higher rates of self-harm, suicidality, than their white peers. Gender diverse youth certainly have a higher risk of these things than kids who don't have that identity. And that is pretty consistent across many studies. There are also kind of like class and economic money-based discrepancies. Once again, kids who are from backgrounds where there are less resources, they are less resourced, tend to fare worse. And these are kind of the social determinants of health that are playing out in a really extreme and significant way for our kids and teenagers. This is about depression and social media use in the UK. And Haight is just trying to demonstrate here that with more social media use, this is in hours, you tend to have higher rates of depression, and again, that correlation also meant to show this is not restricted to the US, but is affecting kids in other countries as well. I will note that there is not one study that shows that these trends are consistent in all cultures, in all countries. There are many studies that point in that direction that you could take together to say this is a global phenomenon, but there are also studies that show that this phenomenon is certainly not as, you could say, strong in some places. From what I read, and I didn't get very deep into the data, but There are some countries and cultures in East Asia that tend to be seeing less of this. And the reasons for that, I think, are unknown. Still an area that needs a lot of research. The other thing that this book posits, and I can't get into the whole book, would recommend reading it, is basically that this crisis goes beyond what we might call only mental health diagnoses or outcomes. That there's really an opportunity cost to so much time online. This shows that since the early 2000s, there's been a substantial decline in the amount of time that kids spend with their friends every day. So for the youngest, for teenagers and people in their early 20s, they go from spending over 2 hours a day with their friends on average to less than an hour a day of their friend on average. Probably that has some developmental consequences. There have also been declines in things like academic performance, amount of sleep kids are getting, amount of exercise kids are getting, basically just doing things that aren't the internet.
And this is really age 15 and up, so we're not talking about
Yeah.
elementary school kids.
And I think for elementary school kids, probably the decline is sharper simply because they don't get to choose how they spend their time as much as a high school student would. Just less independence.
But are they spending time with friends online?
Yeah, so there's, yes, they are. And I think the question there is, what is the quality of that time, and is it developmentally appropriate? Because in general, time you spend in person together with people is synchronous, embodied, you're with someone, you're practicing how to be a person in real time, socially and psychologically. Versus online interactions, they can be synchronous. You can be talking to people in real time, but they're not always. And I'll talk about this a little bit, but sometimes you post something, it could be up forever, and so the feedback you get from that is not at the same time, and thus probably has a different effect on your psychological and social development. It's not embodied, you're not with someone. And it's also, of course, a far different ratio of social interaction. So whereas it's possible, of course, to have thousands of friends online, historically, people have had a small group, a small social circle in which to develop. And so there's concern and argument that the social experiences provided online, although once again, they can be beneficial, are not adequate for appropriate development into sort of what we all hope for our children, to be a well-adjusted, capable person. And of course, there are degrees of that and everything, but that's what childhood is meant to do. It's meant to prepare you for adulthood. And that's where we are right here, so this is perfect. We see some really clear trends in mental health and life on the internet. So kids are clearly spending much more time online on the internet than they were even just 10 years ago, even just 5 years ago. Kids are clearly struggling more with mental health, especially with things like depression, anxiety, suicidality, and self-harm. Worsening of the mental health of kids and teenagers seems to be happening globally, and there are very serious and tragic outcomes, namely suicide. And even outside of diagnosable mental health conditions, kids are clearly just struggling more. They're more lonely, they get worse sleep, they're not doing as well in school, and life just seems harder for these kids. So how do we connect those, and how do we try to make sense of it as the adults that are meant to be kind of shaping these kids into adults? The way I think about it, or I've tried to start thinking about not just this, but lots of things that I see in my patients, is like, what is the point of childhood? What are you supposed to be doing at this stage in your life? Whether you're 5 or 10 or 15, what are you doing to practice to help you become the person that you'll be? There are lots of ways of thinking about child development, many theorists, many timelines that have been proposed. Freud, Piaget, Erikson, Winnicott. If you've studied child development, you may be familiar with these. I personally use Erikson's framework a lot, and I think it's helpful to consider here. So he outlined stages from birth to death, about what kind of our jobs, quote unquote, jobs are at each of these stages as people to help us move on to the next stage and develop in a way that helps us to be self-assured and capable. We'll look in particular at the kind of school years to young adulthood, because that's kind of the ages that we're talking about. Young adulthood typically has extended beyond like the high school years, but as we know, development and developmental timelines are changing for kids now. So the first is for school-age kids. Erickson called this industry versus inferiority. So for school-age kids in elementary school up until about puberty, so middle school-ish, 11 years old-ish, their job is to develop a sense of industry. So that means mastering things in school, in life, outside the home. They want to feel like they can do things on their own, they can master tasks, they can be a capable person. That's what a school-age kid is meant to be doing according to Erickson. They need to practice doing that. They need to make mistakes. They need to be given a chance, and that is what they're doing in these years. Adolescence, the roles are what he called identity versus role confusion. So, and I should say the industry versus inferiority. He theorized that if you don't develop this sense of industry at this age, you'll have a lot of self-doubt, you won't be confident, and that will make you struggle in going on to the next stage of development. For teens, it's identity versus role confusion. So developing a sense of who you are, feeling comfortable with that, feeling like you can integrate that into who you are as a person and let you share that with the world. That's what teenagers are supposed to be doing. And if you aren't able to kind of have a well-integrated sense of self, then you're confused. You don't know who you are, you're probably anxious about it, and it makes it hard to make decisions to kind of move you through adulthood. And then finally, young adults, this is intimacy versus isolation. So the tasks of young adults is to be able to develop close relationships, both romantic and platonic, but getting close to people, letting them get close to you, learning that you can rely on people, and that you can let them into your life. Not going through this stage kind of leaves you feeling isolated, lonely, probably depressed. In addition to kind of the psychological development of kids, we also really need to think about the very real kind of neurobiologic, physical changes that they're going through at this age, which I kind of started talking about earlier. Again, in the journal Nature last year, they made a link between development and social media use and how these could be affecting each other. Basically, the teenage years especially are characterized by just wild changes in how your body works hormonally, how your brain is connecting, how you, like cognitively, how you're working. Massive changes happen in this period. These changes can help explain why kids, more than adults, could be more susceptible to the harms of the internet. They also make us question what so much time spent online may be doing to that development. So it's kind of bi-directional. There aren't necessarily clear answers, especially for the second part of what life online is doing to the physical and neurologic development of kids. But certainly there seems to be an interaction there. So a big thing to consider is social rewards. The American Psychological Association published a piece recently that really summarized why young brains are really susceptible to social media. So between the ages of 10 and 12, receptors for what we would call like your happy hormones, dopamine and oxytocin, multiply rapidly in a specific part of your brain called the ventral striatum, which is involved in, it's a reward center of your brain. This makes preteens really sensitive to social validation. So in the real world, something like, I like your shoes, but online, something like how many likes or comments you're getting on whatever kind of content you've put out. It feels more satisfying to those preteen brains than it would to an adult brain, which is one, not going through that period of very high growth in those hormone receptors. And also, as an adult, you have a better established frontal lobe, better established prefrontal cortex, where you just don't need that social input to feel okay in your brain. You have a more fixed sense of yourself as well, so you're not kind of struggling to make connections developmentally in the ways that preteens are. So social rewards, kids are hugely vulnerable to them. Relationships. So in the preteen and teenage years, relationships take central importance. You're learning more complex relationship skills. You're forming emotionally intimate relationships. Anyone, especially who has been a teenager, like, you know how kind of quick and intense some of those bonds can be among preteen and teenage kids. Again, there are biologic processes in the brain that are happening to help make you more open to those experiences and try to capitalize on that, because your brain is really trying to figure out, how do I keep people close to me? Again, historically, this has been through one-on-one interactions or small group interactions. Now that's becoming more diffuse. It's also becoming, I guess, quantifiable in a way that people and teenage brains have never experienced before. So rather than maybe the kind of qualitative experience of how close your friendships are, you have actual numbers of how many people like the things that you put out, how many friends or followers you have online. It's just a very different way of thinking about social relationships. And again, this gets into kind of the asynchronous versus synchronous. Things that are online, people have called them both public and permanent. So unlike kind of like telling a bad joke and getting negative social feedback and then learning how to do it differently next time, posting something online that gets negative feedback may be something you're dealing with for weeks, months, even years. A more extreme level than what typically happens with in-person relationships. Finally, impulse control. It's very widely talked about that teenagers have poor impulse control. The parts of their brain that kind of push them to take risks and try new things grow more quickly than the parts of their brains that tell them, like, hey, wait a minute, maybe this is not a great idea. And so, that's where kids do things like drive too fast, drink too much, do things with people they shouldn't. It also makes them more susceptible to things that social media especially really tries to capitalize on. So things like infinite scroll, not having a place that shows you, like, okay, this task is done. The teenage brain is much more sensitive to that, much less able to stop itself from saying, like, this isn't actually serving me. I need to stop. Lack of time limits, again, it affects things like sleep, because you're not able to tell yourself, okay, this is enough. Push notifications, all these different things that social media companies design are meant to capture all of our attention, adults included, but teenage brains are just less able to resist some of those things when they become problematic or bothersome in their life. Something also to consider with respect to kind of impulse control and making good, wise decisions is that kids' data and information is being used by companies and sold by companies, and it's not developmentally reasonable to assume that a kid can have, or a teenager, can have an appropriate appreciation of what putting things out online, selling their data online, essentially, what effect that may have on their future, if any. You sign a contract, essentially, when you sign up for a social media platform, and it's just not developmentally reasonable to assume that a 10 or 13 or even 16-year-old can appropriately weigh risks and benefits. Finally, sleep is a big thing. Adolescent brains need sleep. Outside of the first year of life, infancy, adolescence is the time where your brain really depends heavily on sleep for development. Sleep has been a problem for teenagers for millennia, I'm sure, but smartphones really don't help. The number of kids getting, I think, at least 6 or 7 hours of sleep has declined a lot, and a lot of that people attribute to being able to have a phone in your room and not having time limits on how that's set up. There's also harmful content. I talked about this a little bit before. There has not been as much protection online for kids as there has been in the real world for kids. Puts them into potential contact with people who could be malicious actors, and kids are not well equipped to decide who's safe and who's not. And I think we've probably all heard stories about kids getting somewhere on the internet that they shouldn't have been, or being people trying to exploit them in various ways, both relatively benign and extremely dangerous and risky. There's a whole spectrum, and again, kids are just not able to appropriately filter that out. I mean, adults aren't able to appropriately filter that out most of the time, and so how can we expect that of our kids? So finally, this is again a quote from Nature, and this just highlights that we don't really know how social media and internet use is affecting kids developmentally in terms of like their neurobiology, their brain structure, functional brain development. There's research in these areas, but it's things that we really need to know. So I'll go through these last slides kind of quickly because I think this would be better as a discussion than as just reading through these points. What can we do? There have been, this is a question I get asked and struggle to answer succinctly. Different organizations have proposed different guidelines, recommendations, criteria. Some of them I think are more specific and helpful than others. I'll just kind of show you what some of the organizations I talked about today, what they've said, and then I'd love to open it up just for discussion around what you guys think. So this is ACAP. This is the association that I belong to. These are their recommendations, and I think an important point is that they basically lead with saying screens are here to stay. They can offer positives, but you need to invite some gray area into this and figure out what works for you and your kids. They highlight not just what kids are seeing and how much time they're spending, but also modeling good behavior, trying to encourage use that's more healthy versus use that might be more problematic, and basing use and independence based on your specific kid and their development and capabilities. This is the APA. We talked about this. They had 10 recommendations. These are just what the summaries are. Again, try to encourage kids to use social media for good rather than for bad. They advise adult monitoring for kind of preteens and young teenagers, again, increasing autonomy as age increases. Try to limit exposure to harmful content, including things like inappropriate sexual content, racist and bigoted content, and just malicious content overall. And to provide adolescents with social media literacy training as a matter of universal kind of intervention, as well as studying what exactly is happening here more. This is what the Surgeon General advised. That report actually had different recommendations for different stakeholders. So they have what parents can do, what kids can do, what lawmakers can do, and what I think community members can do. This is what parents can do, because I thought would probably be most applicable to everyone. Very similar themes, encouraging also some very intentional tech-free zones, and empowering kids to know kind of what they're doing online and how they can advocate for themselves. They also suggest working with parents to support a shared norm as a community, because of course a lot of kids' online life is because of what's happening with the other kids around them. So if you're going to do some of these things, do them with other parents, with your community, to help support your family and your kid. In the book I mentioned, Jonathan Haidt made some more succinct recommendations. His recommendations are no smartphones before high school, no social media before age 16, and for there to be actual age verification protocols. Kids nowadays are not legally, they're not supposed to be able to sign up for social media before 13, but use is rampant among younger kids. To implement totally phone-free schools. This has been increasingly done across the country, including in many schools in the Twin Cities. And encouraging more unsupervised play and childhood independence. So not just minimizing the online stuff, but also intentionally increasing kids' access to more, what you might call a more free-range childhood, including for teenagers as well. Yeah, so I'd love to hear from you. Like, what have you seen worked? Has anything worked? What do you think of some of these recommendations? Do you find them helpful? Is it nonsense? Yeah.
Before I get to that, I have one question. So my daughter's in 3rd grade, and we're seeing a huge shift in the curriculum to be And I'm wondering how that factors in. So it's not social in the same way as social media, but she's spending a majority of her school day using apps to learn reading and math for the curriculum. How does that factor?
Yeah, that's a great question.
My gut is like, ah!
No, I have the same fear actually for my kid, and I know this is totally anecdotal, not research based, but I know of people who have sent their kids to different schools or paid for private school because the school does not use any kind of online technology. They use books and notebooks and stuff, and that's obviously a huge privilege to be able to do that. As far as I know, there is not a lot of independent evidence to suggest that learning with technology in the classroom helps kids learn better than traditional forms of learning. Obviously, COVID was a different time. Obviously, there are kids with different needs. There are schools with different levels of resources. But I think this has been a big push, and I'm not certain that it's supported by evidence. I think what people would say is that those iPads and computers at school are meant to be sort of like locked down so that kids can't communicate socially or use those platforms socially. What I've heard in practice is that that is not very effective. For example, teenagers use things like Google Docs to type to one another, and you parents are all nodding your heads like, yes, I've seen this. So I don't know that we know that that's safe or helpful developmentally for kids. And there's obviously been a huge push toward technology and education, which I suspect is promoted by many factors, including those of capitalism. And so I think it's a great question and one that we really need to be asking seriously of our educators. I'm not an expert in education, but I know many teachers who have a lot of opinions about this and don't find it as helpful. Yeah.
The other piece I've done a lot of reading about this, and the other piece I haven't seen is development of a program that helps expose kids intentionally. So we can, with iPads in third grade or whatever it is, to teach them then about ways to use iPads and how do we demystify it, demystify technology in some ways without then opening access to all of these things that shouldn't be available.
Yeah.
And I keep looking for something else.
No, I think that's a great kind of starting that media literacy early. Because, I mean, an iPad isn't inherently bad. I think I use my phone all the time to look things up. It can expose you to a huge part of the, to the world in really profound ways. But I think ideally using them as tools and not as the main or the only ways in which we kind of conduct our life, and really clearly delineating between academic time and social time.
And something that we're raising kids in an era that we did not grow
Exactly,
up in.
yeah.
So like my high schooler doesn't even have a locker at school. He doesn't
Yeah,
need it,
yeah.
'cause everything he needs is on the iPad or the computer, and so he just carries that around in his backpack all day. So
Yeah.
there's no these big heavy books and schlepping them back and forth or forgetting stuff at school because and we have no idea if this is the better way of learning or if it's just convenient or efficient.
And probably it's a little bit of both. I mean, I don't think those big books were good for any of our backs back in the day either. And it's easy for me to say, like no technology, but it's not practical in a lot of ways. When we have the technology available, why wouldn't you use it? So I think it's, again, a matter of kind of nuance and intentionality, which is hard to do in the world today with so many competing interests and priorities.
I just want to remind you to fill out your evaluations when you do leave, and remember to turn them in as you leave the conference, and your name will be put in for a prize. And there's always lunch downstairs and resources too, so you can continue, or lunch is being served.
Yeah, we'll do one more question. We'll wrap up. This is my email address. Feel free to email me if you have more questions, if you want to talk about something. Yeah, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it, and thank you for your engagement. Did you have another question?
No, it was just a simple recommendation. I have a physician friend.
Okay.
Best friend that he has like 2 kids, 12-year-old and 14-year-old. Then he didn't give them a smartphone until now. But for his 14th, he signed up. He came up with a 14 contract that they need to sign
that's
up.
great. That's
then
great.
He just sat down with them, went over it. Then he gave his child, like, with limitation of
That's great. I love that.
I really
Yeah. I've heard of parents doing that or of offering different kinds of rewards for delaying access to a smartphone. So thank you so much. Thank you all.
thank you so much.